What vegetables can you plant directly after you've harvested your potatoes? And that's a common question I see vegetable growers asking, is how can I utilise that space that my potatoes have now made and plant something straight in their place? And as you can see, this year I've been growing my potatoes in containers, but the advice I give in this video works exactly the same if you're growing your potatoes using a traditional method directly into the ground in your vegetable garden or your allotment. So what I'm going to do is provide you with 5 suggestions that can be sown directly into the ground when you've harvested your potatoes, and also 5 vegetables that you shouldn't sow directly after potatoes. And by following the advice in the video, you'll be able to maximise the space you've got available and prolong your harvest to utilise that additional space that your potatoes have now given you. Now, whether you grow your potatoes in containers or directly in the ground, when they're coming to the point of being ready for harvest, they'll start to look a little bit like this. They'll start to die off and go yellow, and the foliage or the leaves and the stems will start to droop, and that's an indicator that your potatoes are ready for harvest. And depending upon the variety and type of potato, whether that's determinate or indeterminate potatoes if you're from the United States, or in the UK we refer to first early, second early and main crop, and each of those varieties will be harvested at a different time because they take slightly different lengths of time in order to be ready for harvest. So for example, this particular variety of potatoes you can see here is a main crop of potato called Picasso, and they would take 16 to 18 weeks from the point in which I planted them. So these are now becoming ready for me to harvest. And just in front of those I have a number of buckets there which appear empty, but in fact they have got potatoes in them as well. They are a second early variety of potatoes called Charlottes, and a few weeks ago I cut the stems down to the compost and left them in the containers just to give them an extra couple of weeks in the soil, and that will help me with storage. So to decide whether I'm going to harvest my potatoes, I always use the foliage or the leaves as an indicator. Now in this example here, on this side here, which was planted at exactly the same time as this pot here, this particular plant has still lots of green leaves, and although it's starting to yellow a little bit at the bottom, it is still quite healthy. So I'm going to leave that for a week or two and wait for it to become like this plant here, which has now completely drooped and the leaves have started to yellow and die off. This is now ready for harvesting. But of course you don't need to waste the compost or the area that you're planting your potatoes in and wait for next season to plant something else. And that's what I'm going to show you in this video today, show you what to do with your ground, your compost, and what you can potentially put in there in order to prolong your harvest. I'm going to empty one of these containers here which had the Charlottes in them and show you what I'm going to do with the compost, what I could potentially plant in that container straight away. Now the first thing to do is harvest the potatoes that you've already got, and that's something I always enjoy every single year, no matter how many years I've been growing vegetables. Now if you have used a traditional method of growing your potatoes in the ground, then you'll need to harvest your potatoes using a garden fork and just carefully lift them out of the ground. But one of the advantages of using containers is that I can just tip the container directly into my wheelbarrow here and just shuffle around and look for the potatoes. Let me just put them just in the corner over here. So what I'm going to do now is just get all the potatoes out of this container here, make sure there's none left, and then we're going to reuse this compost in order to plant something else. So let's just get the rest of these potatoes out. Right, so that's my potatoes all harvested, and I'll take these inside and give them a bit of a clean, but that's left behind now my compost, which was for the container. I've moved through the compost and I think I've got all the potatoes out of there, and now I want to utilise this immediately. Now if I want to plant into this compost, or you want to plant directly into the ground where you've harvested your potatoes, then there are 1 or 2 things you might think about doing just to put back a few nutrients into this compost. Now potatoes are particularly heavy feeders, particularly nitrogen, so while they were growing in this compost or in your ground, they would have been taking a lot of nutrients out of the ground, and that's not really beneficial to any vegetables that you grow after them, because clearly they also need nutrients. So before we plant our new vegetables, we might think about adding some nutrients back into our compost. So what I'm going to do is use my container here and fill it half back up with the compost without doing anything to it, which I'll do now. Okay, so that's now half full. You might think, well, why is it only half full? Why not just fill the whole container up? And the reason is because potatoes are a root vegetable, they do grow quite deep. But some of the vegetables you might be growing in their place directly afterwards might not need to grow as deep. And therefore, I'll tend to add any additions to the top level of the container. And that's what you would do in traditional beds as well. So if you want to add nutrients in a traditional bed, all you want to do is dig up your potatoes, try and get the soil as fine as you possibly can. And any additions put on the surface and then rake it through. So what I'm going to do now is take the container out of here and show you some of the things I'll be adding to my compost. So let's just put this to one side. I'm just putting the compost into the middle because I want to mix it now with a few things. There's two things I'll be using to add a little bit of nutrients into this soil. One of them is just a multi-purpose compost. This is just your standard multi-purpose compost that you might buy in bags, or you may be even lucky enough to have some of your own homemade compost left. Add some of that into the mix because that's got lots of lovely nutrients in it. You don't need to add loads. I'm just putting about 5 or 6 handfuls here. If you're using traditional beds, you might scatter your compost over the surface and then rake it all in. And something else I'm going to add, which is an absolute favourite of mine, is fish blood and bone. So I'm going to take a couple of handfuls of that and just put it into the compost and then give it a good mix. The fish blood and bone has a really balanced amount of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, which is good for all aspects of plant growing in terms of the foliage, the veg and the roots. So I'm going to give that all a good mix. Make some room in the barrow, put the container back on top and then just top it up with this lovely mix now, which has lots of nice nutrients in it. Now I have a repurposed container full of the compost that I use for the potatoes, but now with a few minor additions, it's going to be perfectly good to grow other vegetables. As I've mentioned, exactly the same technique would be used in a traditional bed. The difference would be is you would put your compost and your fish blood and bone over the surface after you've taken your potatoes out and just rake it all through. So now that we know that we can reuse the compost from our potatoes, what can we plant in it? And that's what we're going to look at next. Now, a fantastic vegetable to sow directly after potatoes is French beans or field beans. Now, the good thing about beans is that they're a nitrogen fixing plant, which means that they have a good relationship with soil bacteria and they can convert atmospheric nitrogen into a usable form, which is fantastic for the health of the compost or the soil. And as I mentioned, potatoes are heavy feeders and they take a lot of nitrogen out the ground, and most varieties of beans will help to replenish that supply, and that's why they're a great vegetable to grow directly after potatoes. Now, it's very dependent upon which part of the world you're from, whether you'll be able to sow seed or you might need to put in small plants, because most varieties of beans are not frost hardy, so you need to make that judgment based upon how long you think you've got until your first frost. But if you've already started beans earlier and you've got some small plants, now's a great time to put them into the area where you've just taken your potatoes out of. Now, because the soil in your open beds or the compost in your containers is nice and loose because you've just extracted your potatoes, another fantastic vegetable that you can sow directly afterwards is leeks. Leeks are great for transplanting in July and August. It's probably a little bit late to start them from seed, but if you've already got some leeks, which should be around about pencil size, they're fantastic now to put directly into the ground straight after your potatoes. And the great thing about leeks as well is that they're reasonably low feeders in relation to nutrients. So even if there is a slightly depleted nutrient supply in your ground or in your compost, leeks are still likely to be absolutely fine in that position. Now, there are many frost-hardy varieties of leeks that will survive all through the winter, so just check the variety before you do put them in the ground. But a fantastic variety that I love growing is a variety called Musselburgh, and if you've never tried those before, it might be worth giving them a go. Now, I doubt very much the next suggestion is going to surprise you at all, but something else that's fantastic for sowing directly after your potatoes are your leafy greens. Over here you can see I've got a couple of varieties of lettuce, Little Gem and Winter Density, which in fact I'll be putting in this particular container here. I'll probably be putting between 5 and 6 in here just to give them enough space to grow. Additionally, in one of my other containers I'm going to be growing rockets. You can see here it's just a lovely size now to transplant, so that can be put into a container as well. And I've also been growing some Swiss chard, and that'll also go into containers. But these leafy greens are great because they have very shallow roots, so they won't be searching for any really deep nutrients, and they don't take a lot of nutrients out of the ground, so they're perfect for planting in your position where you've just taken out your potatoes. Other leafy greens such as spinach spinach or mizuna or other mustard leaves are also fantastic for growing directly after your potatoes. Now my next suggestion is carrots. You've just seen how I've loosened this compost up, and if you dig your potatoes in the open ground, you're automatically breaking the ground up to get your potatoes out. And what's left behind in most cases is quite a granular soil or compost, and that's perfect for growing carrots. And because carrots, like potatoes, are also a root vegetable and therefore will grow downwards, they really will enjoy that loosely compacted soil or compost. And if you are going to put carrots in there, when you're harvesting your potatoes, just have a mind just to take out any stones that you find, because that can hinder the growth of the carrots. And that's often what results in carrots splitting when they come into contact with a stone. But carrots are another great vegetable to sow into the ground or into containers straight after you've harvested your potatoes. Now my final suggestion for vegetables to grow directly after potatoes is radish. And all the videos that I recommended radish for growing month by month, and that's a lot of them because it's such a quick growing vegetable. I've always said that I found growing radish really easy. Somebody put a comment a few videos ago saying that they actually struggle with growing radish in their particular area, but I've always found them to be reasonably easy to grow. And the only problem I've had in the past is where the leaves have been attacked by flea beetle, and that can devastate the crop fairly quickly. But because they grow so quickly, it's easy to sow them maybe every 3 weeks on a regular basis, and that should give you a reasonably good supply. And radish are perfect for growing directly after potatoes because of the fact they grow so quickly, but also because of the loose soil or compost. But if you're growing other vegetables directly after your potatoes that I've not suggested in the video, then please add a comment below and let me know what they are. And as always, it's great for other people who watch the video and read the comments to share that information, just to give them 1 or 2 ideas. So that's the 5 vegetables that I would recommend. But what about vegetables that are not good to grow directly after potatoes? And that's what we'll cover next. Now the first crop you shouldn't grow directly after potatoes is potatoes themselves. And the reason for that is that if you do have any underlying diseases in your potatoes that you've just harvested, they may stay in the soil or the compost. Therefore, when you plant a new crop of potatoes, it will be quite easy for those diseases to spread onto your new crop. In fact, when I had my allotments, I used to grow lots of potatoes. I used to do a 3-year rotation where I would not plant the potatoes in the same place until after the 3rd year. And those of you that watch the channel on a regular basis will know that the Charlotte potatoes, my second early potatoes, were subject to potato blight. And if you want to know how to identify blight, what to look for, then check out that video. In fact, I will put a link to that in the video description below for you to watch in your own time. As luck would have it, I caught that blight really early and managed to cut off the foliage very quickly before it had a chance to spread. In fact, it was only in the leaves and at the very top of the stem, so it hadn't made its way down to the plant or anywhere near the compost. But it would be really unwise of me to try and plant potatoes in those containers when I know that I've already had blight. So therefore the first vegetable that you shouldn't plant directly after potatoes is actually potatoes themselves. Now the next 2 suggestions for vegetables that you shouldn't grow directly after potatoes are very closely linked together, and that are tomatoes and peppers. Now at the time of year when you harvest your potatoes, unless you've got indoor growing conditions, it's highly unlikely that you would plant these directly outdoors, clearly because by that point you're likely to be into late summer or early autumn, and it won't be too long before the temperatures start to cool down. But if you have got growing conditions where you're growing potatoes, where you are thinking about putting tomatoes or peppers in, then it's not a great idea. And the reason for that is because tomatoes and peppers are affected by very similar diseases to potatoes. So if there are any underlying bacteria in your soil or in your compost or any other diseases, it'll be very easy to spread to your tomatoes or to your peppers. So these are another 2 vegetables that you shouldn't plant directly after potatoes. And for exactly the same reason as tomatoes and peppers, cucumbers are another vegetable that you shouldn't sow directly after potatoes. Again, because of the possibility of similar diseases from the potatoes directly affecting the cucumbers. As you can see, this is an outdoor variety of cucumbers called Markimore 76, but there are lots of indoor varieties of cucumbers which many people grow in greenhouses or polytunnels. And if you do grow potatoes in those indoor environments and you're thinking about growing cucumbers, it's not a great idea. So cucumbers are another vegetable that you shouldn't grow directly after potatoes. Now my final suggestion for a vegetable that you shouldn't sow directly after potatoes is one of my absolute favourites, and that is sweet corn. I absolutely adore sweet corn, but unfortunately in my garden this year, because I've downsized a little bit, I literally have had no space to grow sweet corn. But I'm trying to think about how I can resolve that next year, because sweet corn is one of the most fabulous crops that you can possibly grow. I just love the height and the vibrancy of the crop, and also the sweet corn that's produced is absolutely fantastic. But it's not a great crop to plant in ground when you've just taken potatoes out. And the main reason for that is sweet corn are really heavy feeders, so they do require quite a lot of nutrients, and it's likely that the ground that's left behind by the potatoes isn't going to have sufficient nutrients in to allow your sweet corn to thrive. So sweet corn is not a great crop to put in the ground or in containers directly after you've taken your potatoes out. So there you have my 5 suggestions for vegetables that you can plant directly after potatoes, and 5 that I don't recommend that you do. If you've got any other ideas, either vegetables that you can plant or vegetables you wouldn't recommend, then pop them in the comments below, because it really is great for people on the channel to share that information. But I do hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you want to subscribe to the channel for future videos on how to sow and grow fruit, vegetables and flowers, and 1 or 2 recipe ideas, don't forget to press the subscribe button. And I'll see you all on the next video.